What happens when the power of an HOA meets the political muscle of a state governor? When John Thornton's mountain mansion was threatened with demolition over unpaid fines, he didn't just fight back, he used his position as governor to take down the HOA that had been terrorizing the entire neighborhood. This isn't just a battle over property, it's a clash of power, justice, and the price of standing up for what's right. John Thornton had worked tirelessly for years to earn the life he now led, a life of luxury in the remote mountains. His mansion was a modern-day marvel, perched at the edge of a quiet valley, surrounded by dense forests and pristine lakes. Every corner of the house reflected his achievements, from the glass walls that offered a view of the sunrise over the peaks to the sprawling gardens that seemed to go on forever. John had always been the epitome of success. He was the governor of the state, a position that gave him power, influence, and the resources to enjoy the life he'd earned. But when he first moved to this secluded part of the state, he didn't realize just how much control the local homeowners association HOA had over his life. At first, the HOA seemed like a mere formality. They sent out newsletters, reminded residents of trash pickup times, and occasionally checked the lawns. But as John settled in, he started receiving notices. At first, they were harmless small fines for not trimming his bushes on time, a request to paint his mailbox a certain color. He dismissed them. Who cared about a fine here and there when he could afford it? One afternoon, John received a letter from the HOA with a fine of $500. The letter was formal, typed with precision, and listed an infraction that seemed ridiculous: a violation for a dead flower in the garden. He laughed it off at first, thinking it was a mistake. After all, this was his garden, and surely the HOA had more pressing matters to attend to than a single wilting petunia. But the fines didn't stop. Over the next few months, John received more letters. They were always minor infractions. Tree branch hanging too low, a garage door not painted the right shade of white, a decorative stone in the wrong place. The fines started to accumulate, and soon, the total was in the thousands. John's frustration grew. He had the resources to pay, but it wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. One day, during a conversation with his neighbor, he learned that other residents had been receiving similar fines. Some were even getting fined for leaving their trash cans out too long after pickup. John realized that the HOA wasn't just a way to maintain order in the community. It was a tool for control, and it was becoming increasingly oppressive. By the time John received his 10th fine, he was fed up. He hadn't been perfect. He admitted to missing a few deadlines, but the constant barrage of fines felt like harassment. The HOA was picking on him. It didn't seem fair, and it didn't seem right. What bothered him the most was that the HOA's enforcement felt arbitrary. His neighbors, many of whom had been there longer, were never fined as often as he was. Some of them hadn't even received a fine in years. The HOA had clearly established a reputation for being draconian. Their enforcers, a group of overzealous volunteers, seemed to take pleasure in the power they held over the residents. John wasn't the only one affected. The entire neighborhood was suffering in silence. The fines piled up, and residents were too intimidated to speak out. John, however, wasn't the type to back down. He called the HOA office multiple times, attempting to negotiate and explain that the fines were excessive. The response was always the same. Rules are rules. The more he tried to reason with them, the more they dug their heels in. It was clear they had no intention of relenting. Then the day arrived that pushed John past his breaking point. It was an unusually hot afternoon, and John had just returned from a long day of meetings. As he walked up to his mansion, he noticed an official-looking envelope wedged between the doors. The HOA had sent him another letter. This time, it wasn't just a fine. The letter claimed he owed a staggering $10,000 for fines and late fees, and if the payment wasn't made within 30 days, his property would be seized and demolished. John froze. His beautiful mansion, his pride and joy was on the line. He read the letter again, and then again, trying to process what he had just read. The fine had come because he missed a deadline for an exterior paint touch-up on the side of the house. He'd been traveling and hadn't noticed that the paint had started to peel a little. He couldn't believe it. They were threatening to destroy his home over a small mistake. It was as if the HOA was punishing him for not being perfect. He had paid every other fine, followed every rule, and yet they were going to tear down his mansion over something so trivial. At first, John considered paying the fine. He could afford it, and the thought of losing his home was enough to make him want to comply. But something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to be bullied anymore. He wasn't just some helpless homeowner. He was the governor of this state. He had the power to fight back. John knew he couldn't just let the HOA walk all over him. He also knew that this was about more than just his mansion. It was about standing up for the entire community that had been suffering under the HOA's iron fist. It was time to take action. The next day, John called a press conference. In a calm but determined voice, he revealed his identity as the state's governor. He explained how the HOA had targeted him unfairly and threatened to demolish his home over minor infractions. He promised that he would use his political power to reform the HOA system and put an end to its abuses. The news spread like wildfire. Local media outlets covered the story, and soon, people across the state were rallying behind him. The HOA had underestimated John Thornton. The following weeks were filled with intense media attention. People were outraged that the HOA, an unelected body, had the power to destroy people's homes over minor offenses. John's press conference had made waves, and now the world knew the full extent of the HOA's actions. But the revelation didn't stop there. John's popularity soared, and people began to question how an organization like the HOA could have so much power. It became clear that the HOA's reign of terror had to end. As the governor, John had access to state resources and legal teams that could take on the HOA. He filed lawsuits, pushed for legal reform, and called for an investigation into the HOA's practices. The more he dug into the HOA's finances, the more he uncovered shady dealings, favoritism, and corruption. What shocked everyone, however, was that John wasn't just taking on the HOA as a homeowner. He was taking them on as a public servant, someone who was supposed to protect the people from unjust powers. The community rallied behind him, and soon, his fight became their fight. John's legal team moved quickly, filing complaints, requesting documents, and pressing for investigations into the HOA's practices. The public, emboldened by John's stand, started speaking out. Neighbors who had once been too scared to challenge the HOA now stood with him. The courts were flooded with complaints from other residents, many of whom had suffered under the HOA's oppressive rule for years. As the legal proceedings unfolded, the HOA found itself under the microscope. The public demanded accountability. Every day, news stories surfaced about homeowners who had been fined for ridiculous reasons, leaving their garage door open for an hour, or having a mailbox that was slightly askew. John's legal team painted a clear picture. The HOA had become a corrupt, out-of-control organization that had abused its power for far too long. The HOA tried to push back, claiming they were simply enforcing the rules. But the public didn't buy it. The media pounced on every misstep, and soon it became impossible for the HOA to defend its actions. The tipping point came when John's legal team presented undeniable evidence of the HOA's corruption. Internal emails showed that the HOA had been selectively enforcing rules, with some residents never receiving fines, while others, like John, were bombarded with them. In some cases, fines were issued for non-existent violations, and there were even cases where fines were waived for certain wealthy or well-connected homeowners. Public pressure mounted. The local government, sensing an opportunity to make a change, backed John's efforts. The mayor and several state legislators called for a special session to address HOA abuses, and within weeks, new laws were introduced that would limit the power of homeowners associations across the state. As the legislative session progressed, the HOA leadership realized they were losing. Their reputation was in tatters, and they couldn't defend their actions any longer. The public wanted change, and they wanted it now. Despite the growing pressure, the HOA decided to follow through with their threat. They issued the demolition order for John's mansion. The local authorities, now under heavy scrutiny, hesitated but ultimately complied with the HOA's decision, citing a legal obligation to enforce the rules. John, however, was not intimidated. The demolition began, and the media was there to cover it. As the bulldozers tore through the mansion, John stood in front of the rubble, defiant. He had lost his home, but he had won something far more important: the fight for justice. The image of the mansion being demolished was broadcast across the state. It became a symbol of the fight against authoritarian power and the lengths to which the corrupt would go to maintain control. The message was clear. No one was above the law, not even the HOA. In the aftermath of the demolition, John's legal battle reached its climax. The HOA was forced to pay hefty fines for its actions, and its leadership was replaced. New rules were put in place to prevent such abuses from happening again. John's victory wasn't just personal, it was a victory for every homeowner who had ever felt oppressed by a corrupt HOA. John rebuilt his mansion, but this time, it was built on a foundation of community support. The state passed new legislation that gave homeowners more rights and ensured that no HOA could ever again threaten their homes without facing consequences. John's legacy was cemented. He had not only defended his home, but had also changed the way HOAs operated across the state. He was no longer just the governor, he was a hero who had fought for the rights of the people. The fight was over, but John's story would be remembered for generations to come.